Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you well and in very good spirits wherever you are in the world. And today, if you don't mind, I'd like to continue on with our journey, our exploration through the recent releases made by the Criterion collection during this year of 2021. And that brings us to the release that has been designated by Criterion at spy number 1075. And this is a film from 1982. The filmmaker is Amy Heckerling, and the name of the work is Fast Times at Ridgemont High. This is the work from 1982, and it is from the writer Cameron Crowe, based upon his book, and it is from director Amy Heckerling, and it has, in its really great and brilliant cast, people like Jennifer Jason Leigh and Phoebe Cates, Judge Reinhold, Brian Backer, Robert Romanus, Ray Walston, Sean Penn, and Scott Thompson and others, as well as people like, say, Eric Stoltz and Anthony Edwards and Forrest Whitaker and Nicolas Cage, etc. This is the really classic work in many senses of that term. This is the film Fast Times at Ridgemont High. If we were to try to focus in on, say, the plot or story essence of the film, I think we could talk about the fact that this is a film about high school students, about teenagers, focusing primarily, of course, about their situations and involvements in and around this particular setting of Ridgemont High, the high school in question. It is also a film that is outside of that particular setting or environment. In other words, we see this group of teenagers and their various interactions, their various own subplots or sub-stories, and their own character arcs that are sometimes to do with, say, going to class, going to school, dealing with their teachers. For example, there's a really interesting subplot that emerges regarding, say, the Ray Walston character, Mr. Hand, and the Sean Penn character, Spicoli, etc., as well as other students. And we also see, too, these students outside, as I say, of that particular school setting, specifically, for example, in the mall setting or the part-time job setting. And we see a number of the characters like Judge Reinhold's character or Jennifer Jason Leigh's character, Phoebe Cates as well, in Brian Backer, in various, say, part-time job settings. And so this is, in those respects, a story about kids in high school that are also working part-time jobs, trying to, say, save up for a certain purpose, like, say, Judge Reinhold, etc., in terms of his car and other plans that he has. And in these contexts, we also see their relationships and their interactions between and among each other. This can be based on, say, their relationships that are forged in terms of school life as well as their personal lives. And it oftentimes can border on or can involve a lot of personal aspects. There's discussions and depictions, say, of sex and exploration of a sexual nature and people's own, say, curiosities during this age of teenage life regarding sex and one's own bodies, as it were. So that's one aspect of this, as well as dealing with the various pressures of teen life and the various, say, interesting occurrences or quaint absurdities or uncertainties or confusions, or the simple act of growing up and just trying to deal with that very fact on a day-to-day basis in the regards of these particular characters. And we have perhaps in that mix or in that particular mode or modes of storytelling. We have certain characters that we follow. For example, the Stacy character played by Jennifer Jason Leigh, and her friendships and her relationships with Judge Reinhold or with Phoebe Cates, etc., and also with some of the other boys that she meets along the way as part of her own life and her lifestyle and her own, say, day-to-day living as a high school student, again, in this context of Ridgemont High. So in that way, or in those ways, this film, I think, can be said to be among, or could be said to be one of many different types of film or film genre. So it could be said, for example, to be like a teen comedy. And also because it does have, admittedly, some direct and frank depictions and discussions and representations of certain, say, topics of sexuality. It could also be said to be a teen sex drama or a sex comedy as well, because sometimes those situations or those depictions are associated with elements of humor or comedy. Comedic relief or jokes or the like. And that is also, I think, very much in keeping with the high school student spirit or atmosphere. And it's done, therefore, in comedic ways as well as in dramatic ways. So we already see different ways of seeing this film as a type of teen drama, as a type of sex comedy, and also maybe in the former aspect we can see it as a coming-of-age film, because a lot of the stories that we see are these characters, these high school students, these teenage characters, dealing perhaps in some form or another in their own specific character development ways with certain aspects of growing up and dealing with, say, aspects or traits of being an adult, or maybe one feeling that one is on the verge of reaching, say, the stage of adulthood, as it were. So this therefore can be said to be a coming-of-age drama or coming-of-age drama comedy. And in that vein, this film is very interesting because it's interesting in many ways, of course, but one of the ways it is interesting is that in this idea of coming of age, I think we see these students, these teenagers, and for example, they are working, they are concerned about, say, certain aspects of their positions, like the Judge Reinhold character, the Brad character. He is concerned about what he does at work and what his results are at work, and there are certain consequences, sometimes funny, sometimes sad, sometimes a little bit bittersweet, but it's very much in keeping with his character and his character arc. But we see his interactions not just at school but also at work. And so this is one way in which we see these, essentially these high school teenage kids doing things that are very much perhaps like adults, or like having concerns that are very much like concerns that adults would have about trying to make a living or trying to make ends meet from a certain point of view anyway. In that same vein, we also see some of the characters engaging in activities that probably one wouldn't necessarily think would be within the purview, say, of the day-to-day activities of teenagers or high schoolers. And so we think what some of these people do in order to, say, make money or to make some extra spending cash on the side. And I'm speaking, for example, about the Robert Romanus character as an example, what he does in order to save up, as it were. And it's not just in this realm of working or economics that it can be said that these teenagers are perhaps doing things that are also part of adulthood life, for better or for worse. Also, we see this in the realm, as I say, of the film's depiction or exploration or discussions of sexuality. Now, as I say, this film does focus in on the sexual curiosities of a lot of these characters, including the curiosity that some of the characters have in terms of, say, having their first sexual experience or meeting people that they are attracted to, how to communicate with people that one might be maybe physically attracted to, and how there's a joking, maybe innocent quality about that, but also it does mean that in those ways these characters are dealing with very adult-related themes. And what I mean by that is themes or concerns or situations that perhaps are also part of living as one's life in the stage of adulthood. And so in terms of, say, their own physical and sexual curiosities and their own explorations in that realm, as well as their own lifestyles vis-a-vis their economics, we see these characters, a lot of them anyway, dealing with life and life situations that are part of adulthood, not part of teenage life, as it were. Perhaps another way to think of that, one might not necessarily think that this is the realm of teenage life, but in fact, what perhaps this film is then telling us is that children, or these teenagers within this particular story and this particular environment, are having to deal with these very much matter-of-fact situations that are part of adulthood early on in their lives. Now, this is, as I say, set up in a way that is maybe very matter-of-fact and very ordinary, and thus sets the stage for a lot of comedic scenes that are very funny and very iconic in that way. But also, it does make the film, I think, very potentially quite complex in its depiction of the teenage life, again, in the context of this particular community, and the goings-on in that particular department or departments, and how that might be said to be maybe a positive thing or maybe not so positive thing, and how these teenagers are trying to deal with situations as best as they can given their circumstances. And a lot of the times we see them doing, I think, a really good job in trying to deal with certain circumstances in one sense, at least some of the characters do. And yet other characters we see make choices that perhaps from the viewpoint of the audience might seem to be questionable or maybe not necessarily the right decisions. But in any event, we see these children having to make certain decisions or having to deal with certain consequences that are perhaps of the nature or the realm of adulthood. And so that's perhaps where the fast times of the title might come in. And I think this is something that is alluded to by Amy Heckerling and Cameron Crowe in some of the supplements, about how this is a film that is indeed about teenagers that are perhaps growing up and having to grow up maybe a little bit too fast or a little bit beyond their particular moment in life, and how they are trying to deal with that in the way that they can, in the best possible way. And that's not in any way to cast judgment on the characters, that's not in any way to make fun of the characters, but it's just who they are within the moment as they are. And so I think in those ways this film is a very special one, and it's a very thought-provoking one, as well as being very funny and very iconic in those funny comedic moments. And I think maybe in that conversation we are reminded, for example, about how for a lot of these actors and performers, this was maybe their quote-unquote big break, as it were, or the film that was one of their early hits that led to, say, their furthering of their particular careers. And I think, for example, in that context, the character Spicoli, played by Sean Penn, is often brought up in conversation, because Spicoli as a character is one of those iconic characters in this era of cinema, 1980s cinema, in this genre of cinema, sort of the teenage comedy. And his character is really fascinating in terms of what it is, how it's presented, and what the overall character arc or character development is. I think in one of the supplements of the Criterion Collection release, there's a great conversation between and among Amy Heckerling, Cameron Crowe, and filmmaker Olivia Wilde. And I think it's Olivia Wilde who makes reference to Spicoli, the Sean Penn character, as Buddha, as a type of person that has this Zen-like ability to transcend everything, and to have this type of innate sense of wisdom in this wonderful way that is also very touching, as well as being very comedic and very much iconic in that way. So that is, I think, another example of how there can be something about this film and that can be looked at from different perspectives and can lead to different results or different interpretations, much like the film itself in terms of its various levels of engagement or possible engagement. So, and then ultimately it is a very famous film. It's a kind of iconic film, again, from this particular period of cinema, the early 1980s, but it has this longevity and this lasting power that is really quite profound and quite epic. It is known, of course, as a comedy, and it is a comedy that does deal in some ways with very serious themes of teenage experiences, angst, and also adulthood and the like. And so it is so much. It is a very complex package of a cinematic experience that is also very funny and iconic and a classic of its era. So this is the very, very famous film. It's now in the Criterion Collection. This is the film Fast Times at Ridgemont High. The Criterion Collection has released Fast Times at Ridgemont High at SPY number 1075, and this is purported to be based on this new digital transfer created in 16-bit 4K resolution, according to the materials in Criterion. And so this is a film that has this new presentation, again presented on Criterion for the first time. Now there are some interesting aspects of this particular presentation that I'd like to speak about maybe at the end of my comments here. But before I talk about those, let me focus first on the supplements and what we have in terms of the supplements package of this particular Criterion release, Fast Times at Ridgemont High. So first up, we have a commentary track. This is described as being from 1999, and this features Amy Heckerling and Cameron Crowe, so the director and the writer respectively. It is an older commentary track, and it is a track that can also be found on earlier releases of this film, non-Criterion releases of this film. For example, there is this earlier, say, Blu-ray release, but it's great to have it included with this Criterion presentation, because the commentary track is excellent, absolutely excellent. These are two individuals that are talking with great fondness and respect towards this film, and they're talking with each other. And so it's like this conversation that they're having, and it's a lovely, lovely conversation between the two of them. And of course, they go into various aspects of the production itself and dealing with particular production stories, dealing with their producer, and how perhaps they had a little bit of issue as far as working with the studio, and say, because this film does have very admittedly frank depictions of scenes of a sexual nature. The filmmakers do talk about how they were trying to deal with, say, studio executives with respect to pushback about, say, certain scenes of sex, as it were. There's a particular scene, for example, that involves the character played by Robert Romanus, and that actually is very relevant when we're talking about the Criterion presentation. So I will save that particular point for a little bit later. But that is one example of how this commentary track is really illuminating that these filmmakers are talking about their dealings with the production, as well as their interactions with the actors and the performers, and seeing the types of choices that were made. There's some great insight as to Sean Penn and how he really devoted a lot of energy into his performance as Spicoli, and how he really kept that performance even after the cameras were not rolling, so offset, as it were, in order to maintain his character and the feelings that he felt were important. Also, there is some interesting backstory about for example, certain other people on the set, Sean Penn and his interests, say, and his concerns about certain other people, and Jennifer Jason Leigh and what her demeanor was as an actor, as a performer, especially dealing, because a lot of the film does focus on her character, the Stacy character, and finding her particular character in, say, scenes that might be said to be of a sort of maybe finding her character in a vulnerable position. And I think this has been made a point very early on, especially from the outset or initial release of this film, and it's in fact referred to in the essay of this, and I'll get to this in a moment. In other words, the way in which some critics saw the depiction of the Jennifer Jason Leigh character within the film, and how it might have been seen to be as a critical point of criticism, perhaps interpreted to be a film being somewhat like an exploitation film or a sex exploitation film, whereas in fact Amy Heckerling and Cameron Crowe in the commentary make the point about how, at least from their point of view, Jennifer Jason Leigh as a performer seemed to be very open and very much confident and quite willing to do a lot of exploration in terms of her character, and for example, in the way in which her character is exploring her own sexuality. And so this seems to be very much the way in which all the filmmakers and the performers, Jennifer Jason Leigh included, how they were viewing the character, and how it was, from their point of view, a type of honest depiction of how, for example, the Stacy character was essentially trying to answer these questions that were emerging in her own life about her own feelings, about her own, say, her own body, and about her own view of herself, especially as certain plot points or plot developments occur vis-a-vis her character. And this is true also not just of the Jennifer Jason Leigh character, but this is also true of, say, the Judge Reinhold character, the Phoebe Cates character, etc. And they do speak also, Cameron Crowe and Amy Heckerling, about some of the really iconic moments of this film. There are some very iconic moments. There's one moment in particular, very, very famous, perhaps one of the most famous moments, and they acknowledge this, about which concerns the character of Phoebe Cates, and also what happens afterwards with regards to the Phoebe Cates character and Judge Reinhold character, and they give a little bit of detail about how a certain specific scene was shot and what the reactions were of the particular performers at the time, etc. So for these and other reasons, this commentary track between Amy Heckerling and Cameron Crowe is great, it's essential, and I'm so glad the Criterion Collection was able to bring it on here as part of their presentation. So it's an older commentary track, but it is great. So please check it out if you can. Again, the commentary track with Amy Heckerling and Cameron Crowe. And then also we have another documentary. It's also described as being from 1999. It is called Reliving Our Fast Times at Ridgemont High. It's approximately 39 minutes. This is also, I understand, carried over from earlier non-Criterion releases. And so we have a documentary, a type of making of documentary that also has within it excerpts or edited in it interviews with some of the cast and crew. So, for example, you have interviews with Amy Heckerling and Art Linson, the producer, Don Phillips, Brian Backer, Sean Penn, Judge Reinhold, Robert Romanus, Eric Stoltz, Scott Thompson, Ray Walston, etc. I should say that, just a very minor detail, I think the Criterion sub-menu, the supplement sub-menu, when it has this description about this particular documentary, it does mention how Cameron Crowe is also featured in the documentary, but I don't think he appears directly. And of course, people make reference to Cameron Crowe and the book, and Amy Heckerling talks about Cameron Crowe, Art Linson as well, for example. But I don't think Cameron Crowe is interviewed directly for this particular documentary, so I don't think he's included. But he is, of course, included in spirit, as it were, because, of course, he's spoken about as a very integral member of the making of this film, obviously. But we do have, as I say, other actors and performers and people on the crew that are being interviewed, and again, giving great insight and background in this particular filmmaking process. So it's great to get that, and also how this film is in many ways a type of jumping off point for a lot of these actors who had careers long after this film, and even now. For instance, there's a great mention, a great anecdote given by Amy Heckerling, both in this documentary, I think, and also in there's a great anecdote a lot of great anecdotes that are given about many of the performers. For example, about Forest Whitaker and how the audition process for Forest Whitaker, for example, and what there's a great detail about what happened after that audition that Amy Heckerling delivers or provides. It's just so charming and so lovely. And I think it's also mentioned in the commentary track as well, the Amy Heckerling Cameron Crowe commentary track. So please check out this documentary. Again, it's something that has appeared in past releases, but still it is totally worth it. So please check it out if you can. Then we have a section which is described as being interviews. And so we have the first of these being an interview discussion with Olivia Wilde, the filmmaker Olivia Wilde, and Amy Heckerling and Cameron Crowe. And this is described as being from 2020. It is approximately 34 minutes. It's this Zoom conversation, so I think this was done especially for this Criterion release, and it's done remotely, as I say. It is fascinating and splendid. They talk about many different aspects, primarily, of course, about Fast Times at Ridgemont High, but also how Olivia Wilde, in terms of her own filmmaking, her own work, how she was inspired by a lot of the coming-of-age related themes that can be found in Fast Times at Ridgemont High. How this, and of course other aspects of comedy and comic timing, etc., performances, how these elements of the film might have served or did serve as inspiration for Olivia Wilde's own work as a filmmaker and her own films. So this is a great way in which these individuals are connecting with each other, again, with a mutual admiration and respect for the film. And in that vein, too, they talk a little bit about the origins of the story or the film, and it comes from the book, Cameron Crowe's book, and how this can be seen, therefore, in that way to be, in one way, of course, it is a story, it's a type of comic, as I say, a teenage comedy, but it also, in many ways, it could be said to be a type of look at or an attempt at trying to capture something of the authentic of this particular group of people, these teenagers in this high school surrounding or setting. And so in that way, this film can be said to be maybe a film that is really trying to get at the heart, the authentic heart of what it is to be a teenager in this particular world, in this particular community during this particular time. So based upon that, it can be said to be, it's not necessarily a documentary, of course, but it could be said to have qualities that could be said to be reaching for or aspiring to be capturing something of the authentic, which can be said to be, therefore, in spirit anyway, connecting to a sense of trying to capture or depict something of the real. And so in that way, I think that is the essence of the Cameron Crowe book approach. And then, of course, he applies that in the filmmaking process. And, of course, Amy Heckerling, as the director, too, I think shows us, she shows us in her past comments, say in the commentary track as well, but here, too, she's trying to show us about how she was trying to capture or be consistent with this spirit or philosophy of trying to depict something that feels authentic or something that is not necessarily, say, automatically an adult's imposed viewpoint on what teenager life is or what it should be, but rather trying to respect the way in which this is a film of trying to capture what teenage life is rather than what it should be. And so in that way, she's really revealing, also Cameron Crowe as well, they are revealing how much respect they really are trying to give to the particular subject matter. Again, not to cast any moral judgment on the characters, especially when there are certain very dramatic situations that could occur within the plot. So I think this is reflected so well in other supplements as well, but in particular here in their discussion with Olivia Wilde and how they are trying to deal with specific situations. They They're again also referring to the music, because music is a very important component of this film, the character and the songs that were chosen. This is also referenced in other supplements, the other documentary and also the commentary track as well. But here too, they talk about their choices in music. Sometimes they did have a certain freedom in what they could choose. Other times maybe the choices were somewhat imposed, or maybe they were limited or restricted for some reason. Of course, there's a very famous use, or infamous use, I guess, depending on your point of view, of a particular Led Zeppelin song. And Cameron Crowe and Amy Heckerling, they talk about the reasons behind that particular choice, and how it still works within the context of the particular film. And so that and other song choices are discussed by the two of them in a really lovely and charming and funny and witty way. They also talk about, I mentioned a little bit about Jennifer Jason Leigh as a performer, and about how there is this, maybe related not just to her character, but to other characters. There's this idea of very frank depictions of sex, the possibility of how this film might have gotten an X rating as well. And it does talk about a particular scene involving nudity, involving male nudity as well, and that is also very relevant to the Criterion release. And so maybe I'll bring it up right now in terms of a discussion of the physical media presentation, which is one of the things about this particular presentation that is really fascinating is it is a 4K digital transfer approved or supervised, by director Amy Heckerling, according to the Criterion supplements, or the Criterion description. Now, it is the presentation itself, it is, based on my eye, it's cropped ever so slightly from, say, the earlier presentation that can be found on non-Criterion releases of the past. But the cropping, or the reframing, or the framing found in this new presentation by Criterion, to my eye in general, it doesn't affect me and my viewing experience of the film at all. It's very, from my point of view, there is a very, very maybe slight, but only slight, loss of certain, say, visual information, let's put it that way. But again, it did not at all intrude upon my overall viewing experience and pleasure when watching this particular film. In that context, though, there is one particular scene in this film that it's very obvious that the shot, or the particular framing, was readjusted from what other transfer presentations might give us. So in the past, there was a particular scene involving the Robert Romanus character and his character being nude, and the showing of sort of full frontal male nudity. However, in past releases, this particular scene, or this particular shot, was, say, adjusted in a way that it was framed in a way that one didn't see directly any shot of nudity directly, male nudity, in past releases. Here in the Criterion release, this particular moment has been, or the framing has been readjusted so as to have this particular shot reveal quite directly male frontal nudity, which, as I say, was not evident in the way that it was framed in past releases. So we have, in a sense, a reframing of this particular shot. Now, this is really fascinating because, well, for some people, this might be seen as being, say, an unnecessarily maybe adjustment, or maybe unnecessary touching of the original transfer. So you're getting, perhaps in that way, maybe a different experience. And for some who are used to past versions, that might not be a good thing. And so just please note that there is this noticeable change. However, I bring it up in the context of the discussion of this interview, the Olivia Wilde interview, because Cameron Crowe and Amy Heckerling do mention this. They do mention how, when they were first making the film and this particular shot came up, that in particular Amy Heckerling, they wanted this particular framing to show the vulnerability of this particular character, this character, and his state of being totally nude in this particular moment of the film, because they wanted to show a sense of vulnerability, and also it was in an interesting way, a way in which one can show in a film that has also female nudity, also this moment of male nudity. However, Amy Heckerling and Cameron Crowe describe how at the time studio heads or studio executives were unwilling to go along with that. And so in order to avoid the risk of, say, an X rating, the framing of this particular shot was adjusted so as to avoid any direct shot of male nudity. But that direct shot is now, say, established or reestablished in this reframing of this particular moment, again, as presented by Criterion here, and again, as supervised by Amy Heckerling herself. And this moment is described in this interview with Olivia Wilde as being like a holy grail moment. In other words, something that was lost, but Amy Heckerling and Cameron Crowe really felt was an important aspect as part of this this exploration or discussion of teen sexuality, and also the vulnerability aspect of it, as well as, say, aspects of depictions of male and female dynamics. I think they describe it as a quote-unquote holy grail because it was thought maybe lost, or maybe it would never be restored in this particular way that it was originally intended by Crowe and Heckerling. So I'm very intrigued by the fact I think Cameron Crowe uses the phrase holy grail in this interview with Olivia Wilde. So that's one thing. It's also mentioned in the commentary track from 1999 how this was something that Amy Heckerling wanted to have, but it was rejected by the studio, and so they were forced to reframe it. But now with this Criterion release, it can be restored. It's also something that's mentioned in the Dana Stevens essay here too. So it is something that is known quite famously in the context of the production history. And so we do get this, say, readjustment or re-establishment of this particular moment. So again, if you are of the opinion that any kind of post-release adjustment of any film transfer presentation is inappropriate, then perhaps this Criterion release might not be to your liking, and perhaps it might be better to stick with, say, an earlier non-Criterion release. However, based on these points, and in particular, it's mentioned in many places, the commentary, the interview, and the essay, etc., based on these points about how this was something that the filmmakers intentionally originally wanted but never was able to get, now we're getting it here. So in that way, this particular presentation could be seen, therefore, as being a new way of viewing the film as originally intended. So however you view this particular moment or this particular treatment, or what your philosophy is on, say, post-initial film release treatment, in any event, this does come up in this particular conversation and elsewhere. So please keep that in mind. It is a very fascinating way to consider this particular Criterion release. And I think it makes this particular release very valuable. Again, in a way, it can be said to be the filmmakers' way of reestablishing what they initially intended. So, so this comes up here in this particular great conversation with Olivia Wilde. And also there's a credits, but please stick around, because after the credits there's a little bit of a post-credits comment given by the three of them. So please check that out if you can. Again, a wonderful interview. So this is the interview with Olivia Wilde and Amy Heckerling and Cameron Crowe from 2020, approximately 34 minutes. And then the other interview that's included in this subcategory of supplements is a 1982 interview with Amy Heckerling with the AFI. And this is approximately 47 minutes. This is an audio interview. So she is being asked a variety of great questions. First of all, she is asked about, say, the specific aspects of the film, production aspects, again, the way, talking about comedy and comic timing, and making films about comedy, and also making films about frank depictions of sex. This comes up in this particular component as well, in this particular interview. She talks about Amy Heckerling's own work leading up to Fast Times at Ridgemont High, getting it over with, etc., and the work getting it over with, I mean. And she also talks about working within the industry. There's a certain question that's asked, which is a very curious one about, I think one of the moderators is asking, what is it like to be a woman working within this industry? And I think Amy Heckerling provides a really interesting and quite insightful answer. She says, in essence, she says, I don't know. I don't have any other point of reference because because this is who I am. So I'm making films because this is who I am. And so I found that to be a very interesting response to the question. And there's also further questions from, say, the audience members at the time about how to work in the industry, working with a studio, etc., and the like, because this is also a studio film, right? This is very much, it has an independent spirit, but it also has that Hollywood connection to it. So it's a very interesting mix of these different, say, perspectives on filmmaking. So this, I think, comes out quite thoughtfully in the answers and responses that Amy Heckerling provides, as I say, in this great audio interview from 1982, approximately 47 minutes. And then we also have, as part of the supplements, a really great one, which is the TV version, the TV broadcast version of Fast Times at Ridgemont High. Now, the TV version is approximately 95 minutes. The theatrical version, the main feature of this release, for example, is described as being 89 minutes. So we're getting a little bit longer version for the TV version. Now, this is a really fascinating comparison, as well as being in itself a really fascinating example of a different form or iteration of the film or story, Fast Times at Ridgemont High. So, for example, we get certain scenes, say maybe scenes of sexuality that we found in the theatrical version, they are maybe excised or maybe edited or re-edited in a way to sort of remove the so-called maybe intense nature of those scenes for TV broadcast purposes. So a lot of the times we get some of the profanity or quote-unquote offending language either removed or replaced. And sometimes we see, maybe there's a really interesting moment where the Judge Reinhold character is by himself cleaning off some graffiti on a bathroom mirror, and the actual word that's written in the theatrical version is different than the word that's written for the TV version. So you get little differences like this, and also different ways in which maybe certain scenes are either padded out or in fact added on in order to create, say, slightly different ways that certain plot arcs or character arcs are developed and concluded. So there are slight differences in that way, as well as removing quote-unquote offending scenes or profanity, etc. But in all, it all does follow pretty much the same plot arc as the theatrical version of Fast Times at Ridgemont High. So in that way, it's a really fascinating alternative version of this particular story. And also, if you are interested in seeing just the extent to which, say, the framing is altered for this new Criterion presentation, you can also compare this particular TV version and what's captured, the visual information that's captured versus the visual information within the frame of the theatrical version. Again, just to get a sense of what exactly you are quote-unquote losing. But in my view, as I said earlier, it's very slight, and it doesn't affect my overall viewing experience of the theatrical version. But as I say, the TV version is there for many reasons, one of which I think is the possibility for comparison or comparative analysis in this department. So it's invaluable. It's wonderful to have. So please check out that TV version if you can. It's also very fun. I get a kick of watching the TV version of say these raunchy types of films, and you get the dubbing in order to mask what would otherwise have been profanity or swear words. It's very funny, the types of alternative lines that are used for TV broadcast versions of films. So, in that way, it's also a very funny experience. So please check that out if you can. I should say that if you want the earlier presentations of this film, say in non-Criterion, you can get other, like this Blu-ray, for example. The Blu-ray has an extra supplement that the Criterion doesn't have, which is this little sort of in-menu option, which will teach you, or which will tell you as the film is progressing, what song is on the musical soundtrack at the time, giving you the name and the song title, etc. That isn't here in the Criterion release as far as I can tell. So you are losing that from earlier releases to the Criterion release. But if that's okay with you, there are other reasons that I think the Criterion release is really quite excellent, and the TV version is one of those reasons. So, but just keep that in mind, just in case you're interested in maybe the non-Criterion release or the Criterion release, whatever suits your fancy. And then to round out the conversation, we have the booklet, and I've already taken the liberty of taking it out already, and it's a great one because it's a staple booklet. And as you know, I am a huge fan of the staple booklet. I think the staple booklet is wonderful because it provides a lot of space, potentially anyway, for many writings, as well as a lot of photos and a lot of artwork possibilities, and this one does not disappoint. So we have this great sort of photo collage montage that has this cute and retro use of color and design, and it's also carried over from the cover art design right here, the front and back, which is excellent, by the way. It has this wonderful color scheme as well as the design scheme, this pattern, which is part of the certain, say, decor or fashion of of a certain particular aspect that we see in the film. So well done in terms of its presentation, or this artistic presentation. Art director Sarah Habibi, designer Efron Miller, our production coordinator, William Brizzi. So wonderful job, I think, in terms of this artistic depiction. And then the booklet itself. As I say, I applaud Criterion for the staple booklet format. It has two writings. The first is When We Were Freshmen by Cameron Crowe, and this is a great writing which gives us, again, from Cameron Crowe's perspective, certain specifics of the production, the release, what happened at the release, the initial release, and the immediate aftermath, and working with the studios and working with the particular actors at the time, and the story, the genesis, etc. So again, we get Cameron Crowe's great comments from the commentary as well as from the discussion with Olivia Wilde, and then we get his writing here as an introduction of sorts, or a reintroduction to this film. Again, When We Were Freshmen by Cameron Crowe. That's not all, because we also get this great essay from Dana Stevens called A Kid's Eye View. Now, this is another remarkable, fantastic essay. Dana Stevens, she speaks about this film, being a big fan of this film. She speaks also about certain controversies that arose. For example, talking about how, for example, one of her film critic heroes, Roger Ebert, how he reacted to the film upon the time of its release, and how she now in this essay provides a very, I think, very strong counter-argument to the assertion about how this film might have been seen as a type of sex exploitation film. Kind of tasteless exploitation film, but in fact it is a film, according to Dana Stevens and others, it is a film that is filled with a lot of heart, a lot of sincerity, and a lot of honesty, and a lot of truth in its depictions, and again, in the context, for example, of, say, the Stacy character, the Jennifer Jason Leigh character. And so this is a great essay. She also makes reference to the framing, the shot of nudity that I was referring to earlier, and how this is also part of this presentation or representation of this film via Criterion, how in that way it's actually a very important, significant moment, as well as other really great aspects of the film, and it's how it figures into the particular moment of history that it is. It's this film that is very raunchy and almost very, very playful and very free and very fast. And it's interesting in that it comes in the early 1980s during in the United States, Ronald Reagan was president of the United States, and this is often seen in broad terms as being an era of a type of political and social conservatism. And so this film falls in this period, but it's seen also as maybe prefiguring this period of social conservatism. And also maybe in that way, it can be seen to be even more of a type of interesting, say, contrast with other themes that are often regarded as being part of the social conservatism landscape, at least in cinematic terms. So for these and other reasons, this essay, the Dana Stevens essay, is remarkable and essential. So please check it out if you can. Another great essay from Criterion in its release. So this is the Criterion release of Fast Times at Ridgemont High. Again, for certain reasons, maybe, that I tried to allude to in this video. For some people, maybe the earlier release might be sufficient. If so, that's completely okay. But I think Criterion, in its various supplements and essays and elsewhere, I think is doing a really good job in trying to make the argument for the worth and value of this particular new presentation, and in the context of a specific moment in particular, which I think is a very strong argument. And in fact, it's one that, from my point of view, makes this release a really fascinating one. And ultimately, it is too about the film, and it reminds me just how much fun this film is, how funny it is, as well as being a film that is very serious and is very dramatic at the same time, as well as introducing the world to these great performances, these great actors that many of whom will be going on to have these long careers in the world of cinema and the like. And so for these and other reasons, this film is iconic and classic, and it's well worth it. And if you're okay with, if you're interested about the Criterion release, then I can certainly say that I found it to be very engaging and very insightful. And I'm very glad I was able to get my hands on this. This is the Criterion Collection release of Fast Times at Ridgemont High. Okay, my friends, so that's it for now. And so until we meet again, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great movies. Thank you so much, as always, for your time. I very much appreciate it. Stay strong, stay safe, and cheers.